right, so welcome everybody to our Healthy Professional Worker webinar series, and also jointly co-sponsored with the Canadian Society for Sociology of Health. So this is kicking off our series. And also just to let you know that there will be other webinars coming up in October. Our colleague from Statistics Canada and a member of the CSSH advisors, Jung Park, and in November, another one of our CSSH advisors, Cecilia Benoit, will be presenting. And so please stay tuned for that information. And we will make sure that whatever technical difficulties that we're having, that will get worked out in the interim. So I would like to pass it over to Christina and Nicole, and I'll have you guys introduce yourselves and we can go from there.
Okay. So I'm Nicole. I think I'm just looking at who's on the screen here. I think I know most of you, or met most of you. I'm a professor in the Sociology Department at Memorial University. And I'll say a little bit more about my role in the project a little later. Christina, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Christina Young. I recently completed my Ph.D. in Social and Behavioural Health Sciences at the Dalla School of Public Health, University of Toronto. And I am a research assistant on the Healthy Professional Workers Partnership on the academia case study.
Ivy, did you want to?
Yes, sorry. So as is customary, we would like to make a land acknowledgement. Today is an extra special day. It's Orange Shirt Day for us to remember those who were part of the residential school system and how that continues to this day. So in making a land acknowledgement, we acknowledge that we are gathered across Canada on territory of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people here at the University of Ottawa, where the Healthy Professional Worker Partnership is based. We are located on unceded territory of the Algonquin-Anishinaabe Nation. We extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. And we put this little slide up for everyone to take some time today or other days to recognize where they are at and what treaties are part of the, or not part of the area that, that you occupy. We also recognize that land acknowledgements are only one small part of disrupting Indigenous erasure and dismantling colonial structures. And that is something that we are taking on quite explicitly in the Canadian Society for Sociology of Health and the Healthy Professional Worker Partnership. Thanks.
Yep, and I also want to add that Nicole and I are speaking to you today, both from Newfoundland and Labrador, and we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the diverse territories, are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province.
Okay, thank you, Ivy and Christina. So I'll start. Our goal today, I think, is to generate some discussion about how best to use institutional ethnography in our research on mental health, accommodation, leaves, and return to work. So to that end, we'll start with some background information regarding the Healthy Professional Worker Partnership. I know some of you are part of that partnership and you will know this already, but I know other folks will not. So we'll start with some of the background information, goals, and objectives. And I'll focus specifically on one of the partnership's case studies, academia, because that's the one I know best. Christina will present some findings from our literature review later on mental health leaves and return to work in academia. And then I'll move into a discussion about institutional ethnography. I'll highlight some of its foundational concepts and ideas. And as I do this, I will try to offer some reflections in relation to the academic case study. And I should preface this by saying that this is really a work in progress, and I invite comments, questions, and really advice on how best to do this. So the Healthy Professional Worker Partnership is a multidisciplinary, comparative, and collaborative research initiative examining mental health, accommodation and leaves of absence, and return to work experiences of a range of professional workers, including in accounting, dentistry, nursing, medicine, midwifery, teaching, and academia. And we also have a section looking at people specifically in leadership positions. And Ivy, I'm not sure if you stated already that you were the PI of the partnership, but you are. We aim to understand how personal, family, and work contexts shape mental health experiences of professional workers, and specifically around accommodations and decisions to take a leave and pathways back to work. We are especially interested in understanding how gender shapes these experiences. And to help us do this, we are taking an intersectional and a life course approach. The research design is multi-level, it's multi-sited. We're using mixed methods that include document analysis, observations, and interviews with workers and stakeholders, as well as an online survey and analyzing administrative data. We're also looking at workplace interventions. So it's quite comprehensive. The partnership engages academic researchers, worker representatives, unions, professional associations, employers, service providers, policymakers, and so on. And they are engaged from conception, so conception of the research foci, all the way to translating the knowledge into effective and equitable policies, practices, and programs. So the academic case study focuses specifically on tenure and tenure track faculty, as well as contractual faculty in universities across Canada. And in phase 1, we conducted a pilot study that included a scoping review of the published academic literature, interviews with stakeholders and faculty, and an online survey with faculty. We focused on a number of different questions. I won't go through them all, but they revolved around documenting the mental health experiences of academics in relation to contemplating a leave of absence, taking a leave of absence, trying to understand factors that would prevent or facilitate or constrain a leave of absence from work, as well as pathways returning to work. So the pilot data are informing our current phase of work. I'll call it phase 2, as we continue with our stakeholder interviews, and soon we hope to start worker interviews and launch the online survey. And this slide here is just to note to everyone that Christina and I are not doing this on our own. We have a big team. So Janet Mantler is, I think I saw her earlier online here. She's actually leading this team with me, although I take full responsibility for any errors today in the presentation. So Janet is leading the team with me, and we have a number of trainees. Christina, of course, you've met already, but also Christine Tulk on the line here, I think. And Sam Morton, who recently joined us. Ivy is also involved, and I wanted to acknowledge and give a special thanks to Chantal Demers and Yvonne James, who made substantial contributions to the pilot project. So with all that said, I will hand it over to Christina to work through our lit review.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so as Nicole said, before we move into kind of the institutional ethnography discussion, I want to start by giving kind of a brief overview of the existing academic literature to kind of help situate our study and our research questions. So as Nicole mentioned, the work I'm presenting today draws on an earlier scoping review completed during the pilot study. And I just want to specifically acknowledge Yvonne James, Lana, Etanikovich, and Ivy for their work on that review that I'm drawing on today. So presently, there is very limited published literature regarding the prevalence of mental health conditions among academics, their experiences of taking leaves of absence, or the accommodations that are provided when they return to work. However, the existing literature does suggest that mental health issues are prevalent among academics. So for example, some UK national statistics suggest that 37% of academics have mental health disorders, higher than other occupational groups studied, and levels of burnout that are higher than the general working population. And the existing body of literature is largely psychological in orientation, focusing on kind of the incidence of mental health issues and the personal characteristics associated with increased mental distress. The studies that do draw on sociological or critical frameworks tend to be based on fairly limited empirical evidence. So they offer largely theoretical critiques. So there's a lot of studies that talk about kind of the neoliberal university, or they provide personal or autoethnographic accounts about coping with a mental health issue in academia. So next slide. So we were not able to find any studies that explicitly examine leaves of absence due to mental health issues among academics. And this may be due in part to the fact that existing literature indicates that academics are more likely to seek accommodations to remain at work rather than to request to take a leave of absence. As well, the flexibility of academic work appears to encourage presenteeism, since academics can sort of hide working from home or working in different settings, or they can kind of modify their own work when feeling unwell. So there's a couple of studies that talk about kind of making adjustments to like your teaching or your grading to make it a little bit easier if you are dealing with a mental health issue. So because of this limited existing literature, insight can also be drawn from other types of leaves. So for example, sabbatical leave has been found to promote well-being and decrease the incidence of stress and burnout. And this seems to be especially true when academics limit their contact with their workplace while on leave. Similarly, there is no published literature that we could find about return to work processes for academics experiencing mental health issues in particular. And again, we kind of have to glean some insight from related studies of things like parental leave, vacation, or sabbaticals. So from the parental leave literature, we know that mental health issues can arise after returning to work due to difficulty balancing work and family life and due to insufficient institutional support. As well, a study found a study of well-being following kind of the Easter break period found that a tendency to ruminate about returning to work caused increased mental distress for academics. And this was especially true among a group that they termed kind of perfectionist personalities. So this study is kind of illustrative of the tendency to frame mental health issues as being kind of more of an individual issue rather than a systemic problem. Another study that looked at more of a stakeholder perspective, which is something we're also interested in, found that return to work specialists at one Finnish university struggled to design accommodations for academics who are experiencing burnout due to the complexity of the work and personal factors that led them to take a leave. So because they couldn't necessarily alter somebody's personal factors that might be contributing along with their workplace issues, it was very difficult for them to design these appropriate accommodations to address their burnout when they returned to work. So to kind of make sense of mental health issues in academia, we also want to consider the role of broader contextual factors. Sorry, one second. My slide notes seem to have jumped past the accommodation part. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So going back, so what do we know about accommodations in the literature? So in the existing literature, this idea of accommodation is typically discussed under the broader umbrella of disability. So in these studies, physical and psychological disabilities tend to be grouped together. And a major theme in this literature is the possible stigma associated with disclosing one's disability status as being kind of a precursor to being able to access workplace accommodation. And this is especially true in an academic context where so-called kind of psychological weakness associated with mental health issues could be perceived as contributing to professional incompetence. And some studies in this area critique universities for framing accommodation as being kind of an individual problem that should be advocated for and managed by those who require them. So this research suggests that there can be kind of an uneven distribution of accommodation among faculty, since access then becomes contingent on whether or not you have a supportive department or a supportive chair, rather than reflecting kind of really solid policies and procedures around mental health leaves of absence and accommodations. Okay, so going back to contextual factors, so the existing literature that we've looked at, it suggests that there's kind of two main elements that seem to be especially relevant in this area, and those are gender as well as organizational factors. So with regards to gender, some literature suggests that the masculinized ideal of academic work ignores women's disproportionate caregiving responsibilities. So in other words, there's kind of an implicit institutional assumption that academics are kind of unencumbered by personal and family obligations, which obviously doesn't actually correspond with the reality of many people's lives, and women in particular. As well, women academics appear to spend more time on teaching, service, and advising students. And these are obligations that are often viewed as being kind of less valuable in terms of tenure and promotion and so on. In terms of the organizational context of academic work, some literature suggests that intense demands for productivity and market-based ideologies that kind of commodify scholarly knowledge appear to be detrimental to mental health. And therefore, some critical scholars challenge the framing of anxiety or other mental health problems in this context as being individual problems, because this kind of obscures the role of the intense working conditions in producing mental health issues. As well, existing studies suggest that contractual faculty experience unique mental health challenges that are directly related to their poor pay, as well as their lack of job security. So these are additional stressors that might not be encountered by tenured faculty. So what's missing? So some of the things that we still don't know very much about are how work, organizational, family, and personal contexts impact academics' mental health issues and their desire to take a leave. We also know little about kind of the precise mechanisms by which academics request to take a leave of absence or how they obtain accommodations to return to work. We also need more insight into how these issues are differently experienced by tenured versus contractual faculty. So we have some sense that there's going to be differences there, but there's not a lot of published literature on this. And finally, given this dearth of literature, we know little about how policies and practices could actually be improved to address these issues. So this table just provides a bit of kind of a visual summary of the literature that we've gathered so far. So as you can see, much of the literature is quantitative and primarily draws on survey data. And the existing qualitative literature seems to skew towards these autoethnographic accounts that are kind of just, even though they're in scholarly journals, they're sort of personal accounts of issues that someone has had dealing with their mental health issues in academia. So there's a significant gap in the literature in terms of qualitative inquiry into mental health, leaves of absence, and return to work issues among academics. And it's also important to note that we have not been able to find any studies that use institutional ethnography to address our specific research focus. So I'll pass it back to Nicole to speak a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Christina. So in practice, I'll start by saying that institutional ethnography has been taken up by researchers in different ways. And the authors of a recent scoping review referenced here found that research using institutional ethnography included everything from a close adherence to it as a method of inquiry. Others used it as a kind of inspiration for how to carry out the work. Others used it as a kind of toolbox, pulling out sort of concepts and methods that helped assist with their analysis. And in what follows here today, I'll try to present some key concepts as described by Dorothy Smith, the founder of institutional ethnography, and I pull primarily from her main text on this, although she has been working on this work for a long time before the 2005 text, but that's the text I'll be drawing on primarily. So why institutional ethnography? How can institutional ethnography help us understand mental health leaves, accommodation, and return to work in academia? Well, to start, institutional ethnography is, as defined by Smith, a method of inquiry that works from the actualities of people's everyday lives and experiences to discover the social as it extends beyond experience. So, i.e., if I can use that abbreviation, links micro experiences with macro structures through a foundational ontological assumption that social reality is produced through what people do, and that people's activities are organized, coordinated, regulated by processes that extend beyond the local, the ruling relations. And I'll come back to that idea a little later. But the ontological shift involved in institutional ethnography means not starting with organizing concepts, but rather starting with people's experiences, their activities, their work, as ways to know the social. The focus is on understanding how the social world works, how it's organized, rather than on understanding why. And in part, this reflects the feminist social justice roots of the approach. Smith wanted to develop a sociology for people, not about people. Knowing how the social world is organized means we can change how it is organized and change it in ways that work for people. So for our project, institutional ethnography offers a way to understand how the mental health experiences of faculty, and I'm including here in those experiences, accessing accommodation, leaves, and so on. So how those mental health experiences are shaped by institutional goals, objectives, and priorities. Rather than starting with a research question, institutional ethnography starts with a problematic. A problematic often emerges from a tension, a contradiction, a disjuncture between people's experiences of how things work or observations of people's work and activities, and official or institutional accounts. And we found a number of such tensions, I would say, in our pilot project data, and especially in the interviews with faculty. So for example, tensions between meeting institutional goals, such as those in the P&T process, and constraints with family obligations. Some faculty juxtapose how they understood their experiences of stress, anxiety, and burnout as a result of their own, of their working conditions, for example, heavy workloads, and how university messaging suggested mental health issues could be managed by the development of individual coping skills. Faculty talked about feeling stressed. Some even said they think they should have taken leave at some point, but they didn't feel able to take leave. So these are some of the ways in which our pilot study suggests to us this kind of tension, these kinds of contradictions. To quote Smith, a problematic sets out a project of research and discovery that organizes the direction of investigation from the standpoint of those whose experience is its starting point. So in the case of academics and our academic pilot data, some questions emerge about how this disjuncture is produced. For example, how do universities define mental health? Where do these definitions come from? Do these definitions make sense to faculty? What work do these definitions do? The problematic represents an epistemological shift to understanding knowledge as based on experience and not objectified in advance by concepts or theories. So rather than starting from theory and concepts, institutional ethnography starts from the standpoint of the ruled, usually from the standpoint of marginalized and oppressed people or groups. Though this orienting tool has been, I would say, extended by many researchers to include any institutional standpoint. In Smith's original formulation, she argued that because the standpoint of marginalized groups is usually absent from official accounts, it provides an entry point into institutional processes that may differ from official accounts. However, in any institutional standpoint, people are the experts of their experiences, and their expert knowledge about their experiences will differ based on different institutional locations. And I think I need to be clear at this point around standpoint because other theorists use that same lingo. Standpoint in this sense does not suggest that people have special insight or are able to connect their experiences to ruling relations. For institutional ethnographers, that's our job. So institutional ethnography starts from people's subjective experiences, but the goal is not to describe these experiences. Instead, it's to use this standpoint as an entry into extra local ruling relations, to describe how individuals or groups are connected through social relations, often in very taken for granted ways, and that makes them very difficult to see. So again, thinking about the academia case study, we're working from the standpoint of faculty, hardly a marginalized group, but certainly one that is subject to ruling relations. There are a number of institutional ethnographies that look at academia in particular, and I have a slide later on if folks are interested in seeing some of those references. So faculty, not a marginalized group, I would say, but subject to ruling relations. But there are also differences in the institutional positions between or among faculty. So we have tenure and tenure track faculty, and we also have contractual faculty. So perhaps we are starting from different standpoints. And that's a question I have more than a comment. So what are these ruling relations I keep talking about? Ruling relations refer to forms of governance, social relations that are regulating. They are extra local, but coordinate the activities of people locally. Smith uses the term institution to refer to the assemblage of ruling relations, those that are organized around a distinctive function, such as education, healthcare, and so on. So if I could sort of talk about it in a different way, the aim of institutional ethnography is to map out how society's institutions regulate people's lives. Larger frameworks guide institutional practices that in turn regulate by turning the particular into the generalizable, ordering the messiness, diversity, actualities of people's experiences. And ruling relations are mediated by texts. In other words, as researchers, we can document ruling relations through the work that texts do when activated, when people use them, interpret them, work on them, work with them. And this is what makes it different, I would say, from some other approaches that look at texts as standalone objects. So in institutional ethnography, texts refer to material, in quotes here, in a form that enables replication of what is written, drawn, or otherwise reproduced. Again, thinking of the academic case study, academics work in bureaucratic institutions. They are guided by a whole host of different kinds of texts, everything from P&T criteria, collective agreements, but also things like sick leave forms, return to work or leave policies, training videos, academic journals. All of these things are texts that regulate or that operate in the context of universities. According to Smith, texts are not standalone materials. Instead, institutional ethnography maps out intertextual hierarchy, identifying which texts frame other texts, how other texts are created, interpreted, worked on, and so on. The content of texts is important, yes, because it is normative. Texts are normative in their messaging. However, institutional ethnography is primarily concerned with how texts coordinate the activities of people and link people in social relations. So link people's work through text and text activation. Take, for example, the way P&T criteria in collective agreements or policies work. These criteria shape the kinds of activities that faculty engage in and perhaps even come to value. And they at the same time serve institutional priorities mainly. If we want to think about a mental health example in the context of academia, we can take the example of leave. So in order to take a leave, a faculty member may be required to complete a form administered through HR usually. We can ask questions about the form, what kinds of questions are asked in the form, where do these questions come from? The form most likely has been developed to assess criteria which refer to another text, a policy, which in turn may be subject to other texts like provincial and federal regulations and so on. So the form, once activated, moves across the university, requiring signatures, and at different moments triggering the activation of other texts like physician signatures outside of the university and linking into the work of others. So how do we know which texts to consider? Usually this starts with interviewing or observing people who are subject to the relations of ruling. And this is, again, to use the jargon, a primary data dialogue. Though I will say also at this point that there have been other, sometimes very creative methods to interviewing and observation used to collect data, including autoethnography. The interview focuses on getting at the work knowledge of the person being interviewed or observed. It includes, in quotes, what they do, how they do it, including what they think and feel, as well as the coordination of his or her work with the work of others. So we in our project have included faculty, of course, as in our interviews, but we've also included stakeholders. Stakeholders include people who work with techs in universities, people in HR, as I've said, or union grievance officers. It also includes people in organizations outside the university, in provincial or national associations, professional associations related to higher learning. The second data dialogue occurs when reading the interview transcript or field notes. So through reading, the researcher is looking for traces of the institutional, those things that connect people's work to texts and to other people's work. Institutional ethnographers map out different work knowledges and how texts coordinate work processes. This mapping shows the work of extra local discursive frameworks. That's how we come to see and know the ruling relations. This might start with identifying the texts referred to in interviews, how people encounter texts, how the activation of texts shape the activities of people, and how and which people are impacted. And we are only starting this part of the process. We've started collecting a number of different texts, and I'll hand it back to Christina to have a quick chat. She's been the person primarily in charge of collecting and making sense of these texts.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So our data collection so far has been focused on doing sort of a case study of 3 Canadian universities. So in this table, I've identified kind of a partial list of the types of documents, policies, and procedures that I've compiled related to mental health, leaves of absence, and return to work. And you'll see that I've kind of anonymized the universities here as University A, B, and C. So you can see that these documents include collective agreements, so that would be for tenured or contractual faculty at different universities, leave and accommodation policies, as well as, you can go to the next slide, Nicole, general documents related to mental health and wellness, as well as equity, diversity and inclusion materials, and also information about employee assistance programs and medical benefits. So these are only some of the texts that we're going to draw on, obviously along with our survey and interview data to shape our analysis. And at this stage, I have only compiled documents that are publicly available. So that's interesting to see kind of the divergence between different universities in terms of the types of information that they actually make available on their public website, or if they have their documents kind of hidden under, for example, like a human resources portal that would be reserved only for employees. So I expect that we will gather more documents as we move through data collection, and get a better sense of kind of what texts are mediating, you know, leaves of absence, return to work, and accommodation. So that's hopefully something that we can get more insight of through the interviews, and then that'll kind of help us figure out what texts are most relevant. And we'll also be looking beyond kind of these case study universities, and Christine Tulk, another trainee on the academia team, has already gathered kind of all of the collective agreements from degree granting institutions in Canada. So those documents will also form part of our analysis. So on the next slide, thanks. So I've also started gathering kind of gray literature about mental health in academia. So as you can see, this material kind of exceeds the published academic literature that I discussed earlier. So this is just kind of a list of different articles that I've pulled from sources like University Affairs, Inside Higher Ed, and the New York Times, so other websites that report on higher education or general news organizations. So there's been a lot of focus in The Guardian, for example, about the issue of mental health in academia. And based on what I've gathered so far, I've kind of divided this into three main themes. So articles focusing on the stigma surrounding mental health issues and kind of the need for a greater awareness of these issues. Articles that look at specific services and supports that have been implemented or things that are required to address these issues. As well as articles that focus on kind of the conditions of academic work themselves as contributing to mental health issues. So that's the third category that I have here. So as you can see, kind of a large proportion of what I've gathered actually does focus on this relationship between mental health issues and working conditions within academia, which is a topic that is kind of only tangentially discussed in the empirical academic literature. So this kind of suggests to me that the academic literature kind of hasn't really caught up yet with this popular discourse that is trying to bring light to a lot of these issues and kind of demonstrates the significance of this knowledge gap. So I will pass it back to Nicole now.
Thanks. So that, I think, takes us up to where we are in thinking through how to use institutional ethnography in this case study. So I welcome any comments, questions, advice that people have. I'd really like to hear from other people who are part of the other case studies and to hear whether or not you've started thinking about institutional ethnography in your own case studies. That would be nice as a point of comparison. I can't see comments, so I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, that might be a little bit easier, and so that we can kind of see everybody on the screen. And thanks everybody for coming. And I know some people came in a little bit late, problems with the Zoom link, so apologies for that. But if you'd like to have a comment or a question, please just unmute yourself and put your video on, and we can open it up for questions and comments. Thanks.
If I just can make a comment, Nicole, you mentioned about the differences between faculty that are full-time and faculty that are contractual faculty. And I indeed think that these are two different realities for individuals who work for the university. So it does seem to me that they won't be sharing the same experiences. Just want to make a comment.
Thanks, Lana. Yeah, that's my thinking too. So I hadn't really given it much thought until, I mean, always aware that there are these differences, but in terms of thinking about it as a standpoint, yeah, I'm increasingly coming to that conclusion, I think, yeah.
So Nicole, I've put in the chat a question, and I hope you can sort of elaborate a little bit for me on how institutional ethnography and what you've described in looking at those texts, how does that differ from a discourse analysis or a critical discourse analysis approach to things?
I will do my best.
So,
other people, please join in if I'm not an institutional ethnography expert, so nor an expert in critical discourse analysis. But my sense of it is that institutional ethnography is, yes, Smith herself says she builds on Foucault's understanding of discourse. So it's not that it's something entirely different, but instead, her concern, especially with texts, is how texts hook people into social relations. Mm-hmm. And so it's about understanding how texts get activated, and not just, I would say, so you can analyze a text for discourse on its own, right? Yep. And I think Smith is concerned with how that works its way into institutional practices. So how the text does something that shapes how work gets done for people and hooks into other kinds of texts and hooks into other kinds of work. That's the way I think about it. If anyone else would like to add something, please do.
I'm thinking that this is really appealing to me because I've come at a lot of my recent work from the critical discourse analysis perspective, including looking at visuals and how they're, and how documents or forms themselves are visuals that tend to discipline us. So one of the things I've been looking at in one of my earlier studies was how the income tax return, for example, disciplines people and creates identity. And so I may in fact have been coming at this from an IE perspective without necessarily having been aware of it.
Yeah, that sounds very similar to me.
So
yeah. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I guess one of my fears is, we've got this enormous project already underway, and yet I can see an equally big project all on its own, focused on some of these different perspectives within the academy. When I look at the list of texts that Christina was presenting, there is so much there. So how do we, and I'm struggling with this on some of my own research, how do we put some bounds around when we stop collecting and start analyzing the texts? And part of it is the institutional emphasis for many of us on cutting things down to a 30-page peer-reviewed journal article. So I suppose it is, how do we resist some of those pressures, conduct the research, but communicate it when it's already, it's still part of an ongoing process, as it were.
I'm not sure how to respond. I mean, I share your concern. Commiserate together. I mean, it's a huge. It's a huge project, right?
Yeah.
Huge project, and so I think I'm imagining the institutional ethnography piece as, if I'm remembering the grant application correctly, and Ivy, you can step in here. So I think that for that piece, at least, only some of us are doing some of that work, right, Ivy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I don't think all of the cases are doing it. I think it's just a select, is it? Or is somebody doing it across all the cases?
No, it's kind of like a subset, and in some cases, we're going to be interviewing workers, some of whom are situated in particular institutional arrangements and in particular organizations. I mean, this, an institutional ethnography perspective might be less important, for dentists or physicians out in private practice, for example. However, it's not just that institutional ethnography, you have to be within an institution, it's just how the texts, govern the work that you're doing. And so it's really about, matching those experiences with the text. And again, we don't have to have all of the texts that govern their mental health, leaves of absence and return to work. There may be a specific slice that we want to take. I'm also curious about, just getting comments from a methodological perspective. So we're looking at institutional ethnography in this case of the healthy professional worker study, but there's also the dynamics of just utilizing institutional ethnography in general. And so some of the other folks on the webinar who come from another project, who come from you know, the CSSH group, I'm curious about, you know, getting their questions or just entering into a dialogue about utilizing institutional ethnography for a variety of different projects.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll just add to that before move on is, so I am not an institutional ethnographer, but I've been influenced by Dorothy Smith ever since I was a grad student. And so I've been one of those people that, you know, pick sort of and choose what works for me. And I have a kind of an approach to doing research that aligns well with, I think, the principles of institutional ethnography. I ask how questions. I care about what people are doing rather than what people are thinking per se, although thinking is part of doing, or what people believe or perceptions. I'm more interested in what people, and those things are important, but I guess I'm interested in what people do and why, how it is they do it. So people may want to act in particular kinds of ways, but are unable to act in those ways. And so I guess it's very similar to, I would say, what Sarah Ahmed's calls orientation, right? So she sees people's options and opportunities as in terms of this concept of orientation. So certain paths are available to you and you're more likely to be oriented towards certain kinds of doings or work or activities. And that comes from her work as a phenomenologist, I think. But so I see them in very similar ways. So I guess that's a long way of saying I'm not an institutional ethnographer, but I like how that way of thinking helps us do research. I think there's a comment or question. Oh, Pat Wood said Dorothy Smith rocks. Yes, she does.
So I invite other comments or questions, you know, specifically about the project, about this case study, because there's the project, there's the case study, there's the methodology that, you know, is being utilized by, you know, other members of the team for, you know, similar projects, but also would just really like to hear from others about how you might be using institutional ethnography. And if you're grappling with the same types of issues that, you know, the dialogue between Meredith and Nicole raised.
Okay, this is not what Ivy just asked about, but I think it was a really great presentation from Christina and Nicole in terms of highlighting that most of the research is from psychology, my background, and it's focused on the individual. And that there is this great big gaping hole that focuses on what the institution is doing. And yet we know from the gray literature and the personal experience that it's the institution, not just our local universities, but academia in general, that is doing something that put us in this role. So I think that this research is absolutely essential and we need to start pulling it out. And it's just, your presentation made me realize just how much we need to be doing this, and we have to, you know, get working on it soon. But, you know, thank you for actually making that really clear to us that there is this big gap, and we're one of the first people probably to try and fill it, even though, as Meredith said, it's a huge project and could go on for a really long time.
Yeah, there's actually very little literature that takes an institutional ethnography approach to mental health and in particular leaves and accommodation in workplaces. I did find one article that I thought was good, and I forget the names of the authors. I do have it in the slide. And they speak primarily to, it's in a manufacturing plant, and they speak to mental health and I think leaves. I think they focus on leaves and that's it. But that's really the only one I could find that was close to what we are doing. Yeah.
Go ahead, Laura.
Sorry, I joined in late, so I'm not sure if this was addressed or not, but one of the, I'm working on the home care IE that we're starting up soon. How, does anyone have a sense of how IE deals with texts when they are not publicly available? Or like I have a sense of how this might unfold where we're talking to some case coordinators and they mention some texts or forms that they use, and some they might give us, some they might not realize they shouldn't give us. Others, the health authority, because they're a partner, might not want us to see certain policies. So how is that? Do you have to do FOI requests or?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. If anyone else has experience with that, I've thought about that myself, and especially because I know I can access certain forms, for example, through my own university, but Christina, in looking for those forms, wasn't able to access them. So it's unclear to me whether or not I'm free to distribute those. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, it does become complicated to do an institutional ethnography. And there has been like a remarkable release of text and data, right? I mean, just, I can't imagine, I mean, you know, Dorothy was writing, you know, before we had so much information on the internet. I remember just doing document analysis where you literally had to go to organizational libraries, photocopy stuff, and I feel really ancient, you know, saying that, but we have both a surfeit of text, but a little bit more of a quagmire about how do we have access to that. Now, if something's available on a website that's not password protected, you know, then that's public domain. So that seems to be cool. But then when you get at documents that one doesn't kind of think of as being sensitive, but they are behind a password protected, you know, member portion of a website. So whether that is, you know, for home care nurses, or, you know, we've done this work in long-term care. And in some cases they post on websites minutes of, you know, patient advisory meetings, worker advisory meetings, that sort of thing. So they're, you know, they're public, but there's sort of a really kind of gray area about how you utilize them. And the thing is that when you have documents that you are not privy to, but those are really critical documents to understand systems of governance, that becomes really problematic. So I'll take a very specific example. You know, because we're interested in issues around mental health, leave of absence, and return to work, some of those documents are, you know, behind your faculty member websites, specifically for academics. And then you see the types of forms that you need to take to your physician to fill in order to then have an accommodation, such as a leave of absence. Now, those are really important documents that govern this behavior around taking a leave of absence, but are they actually available or not available? And I think, you know, from an ethics committee perspective, that's, you know, something, you know, we typically say in ethics, you know, these are publicly available documents, but what happens when members of the team have access to documents, which, you know, when we do partner research that we are often encouraged to do through partnership grants at SSHRC or through partnership grants at CIHR, and we have partners, sometimes you get access to documentary data that you want to be able to utilize for your analysis, but then when you want to sort of publish something or a case study, then it becomes really quite complicated. Yeah.
So
I
we have,
sorry. Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. Well, we have our privacy officer at Carleton, and I assume everyone has one of those too. Is that something, a conversation that we should be having with our privacy officers to say, this was behind this password protected site, or yeah, or wherever else you're getting your documents, and we'll have them weigh in on it, because it is partly ethics, but it's also actually then we're going into the privacy realm.
Yeah, I think you're right, Janet. That occurred to me as Ivy was talking. So, because I know that people have accessed documents through universities by using access to public documentation, the legislation, the provincial legislation. So, and that would go through the privacy officer at our university. So I can't imagine if we access that kind of information in that way through that office, that it would be seen as private, actually. I think if we accessed it through that office, it would be, those documents would be seen as public, because we are a publicly funded university, right? I think it would be different for home care depending on whether it's publicly funded or privately funded. But I think any publicly funded, but I think we would have to go through that office first. Yeah.
Well, and it becomes different because, I mean, if we're looking at a form that's not filled in, it does not have any personal data on a form, but it's a form, right? So could we have an agreement, you know, for example, that forms are okay that aren't filled in, but private, you know, private data, you know, in a form would not be considered. Yeah, I mean, unless, you know, you have an interview with somebody and they want to, you know, share some forms with you. And then what are you analyzing? Are you analyzing the form or how the forms were filled? It's a very interesting gray area for sure. So I see some things are popping into the chat and some people having to go, and we are officially at an hour. So what I might do, just for editing's sake, is I'm just going to stop the recording, but we can continue to have a conversation because we have a bit more time booked with that, and especially for folks who came on late.